theyeshiva.net.
So we're going to begin again from Se'iv Gimel. Open your source sheets. It's page 66. We learned a few lines last time, but I'm going to do it again, and this will be number 3 of the Maamer. People were asking what happened to number 3. This will be number 3. I'm going to repeat the lines that we learned in last class because there was some technical mishaps. The key point was that Sfiras HaOmer represents our work with our animal consciousness. With the long explanation, Mashcheni, Narutza, etc., you can hear the first 2 classes on the Maamer of Svartim, Gimel. If we get more specific, Hine, Bebirur Nefesh HaBahamis Yesh Beis Inyanim. In the birur, in the sublimation of the Nefesh HaBahamis, there are 2 elements. There's what's called birur HaMoichin or birur HaMidas. There is working with the moichin of the animal soul. Moichin is its state of awareness, the way it sees the world. Midas are its experiences of life, its emotional experiences of life. And that's why there were 2 stages. There was bringing the Omer, the carbon Omer, and then there was the counting. Meaning, the first thing that had to happen before Sfiras Omer was, they had to harvest barley, as I said in the first class. The pasuk says, "Usvartem lachem imacharas haShabbos miyoim havi achem es Omer hatnufa sheva shabbos mimis tiyana." On the 2nd day of Pesach, Tazayin, the night before, which means the night following the first day of Pesach, by us, the 2nd Seder, those in the diaspora, they would harvest stalks of barley, and those barley kernels were extracted, grinded into flour. That flour was refined, and that flour then, they took a measurement, right, of the volume of 43.2 eggs. This is called the Omer. The Kohen would it's called Omer HaTnufa. It had to be waved, lifted up. There was, of course, the Kmitza, which means the Kohen took a fistful of flour, which was burnt on the altar. The rest was baked as matzah, and the Kohenim would eat it. This is called the carbon Omer. This was brought to Zionism in the morning. It was harvested the night before. From the day we bring the carbon Omer, we start counting 49 days, including that day. And we start counting at night. Because the Torah says in Parshas Acharei Mos, you start counting from when you lift up the sickle to the stalks, to the standing grain, and that's the night. By night. They would harvest it at night. That's why we start counting at night. So there's Hakravas Omer. Hakravas Omer is bringing the carbon in time of the Beis HaMikdash, which is harvesting and then bringing it to the Beis HaMikdash and burning it, etc. And then there's Sfiras Omer, the counting, which will last for 49 days. And by the way, because there's an opinion in halacha that if you didn't harvest the barley at night, you can harvest it in the morning. Therefore, there's also an opinion that if you didn't count the Omer at night, you could count it in the morning with a bracha. Because there's an argument about it. Therefore, if you forgot to count at night, you count the next day without a bracha, because safek bracha is lahakal. Whenever you have a doubt to make a blessing or not a blessing, we take the lenient position you don't make. Because there's an argument if you could harvest the Omer during the day. The Balatanya and Shulchan Aruch Harav, Siman Tov Peites, explains all this at length. So the Rebbe says here, these 2 steps represent 2 stages in a person's work with their animal soul. Hakravas ha'omer inyan birur ha'moichin nefesh haBahamis. Bringing the Omer, which means cutting the Omer and bringing it to the Beis HaMikdash, this represents working with the cognitive faculties, with the levels of awareness, with the moichin. Moichin is the ideas. Moichin means the brains of the animal soul. Ki noisef l'chol ha'sinyan shemin chasem ha'bam and asayda meichel ha'beim shemoid al-birur ha'nefesh haBahamis. Hinei b'meichel behem ha'guf ha'bam mincha min ha'dogan shemoid al ha'moichin kemuva m'mayman azal ein ha'tinin kidei likris abba sheyitim tam dogan. Because what was this offering brought of? It was brought of barley. The only meal offering besides Seitan that was brought from barley was always brought from wheat. Why barley? We explained before. Animal fodder. Why are you bringing an offering from animal fodder? Because this message of Sfiras Omer is, I'm working with the animal inside of me. But you're not just bringing any animal fodder, you're bringing grain. What does the Gemara say in Brachas Daf Mem about grain? The toddler does not know how to pronounce and say father or mother until he or she begins to taste the taste of grain. So some explain the Gemara to mean that in the beginning, when a child is nursing, they don't pronounce, they don't articulate any words. There's no verbiage. There's sounds, no verbiage. But later, as they get a little older, it could begin 6 months, 7 months, 8 months, a year, a little more. Sometimes a delay could be 2 years. The child already starts eating grain. They're not only drinking, they have the ability to eat grain. So then, start saying father, start saying mother. But the truth is, from the language of the Gemara, and we learned at length about this in the Maamer before Pesach, if you remember, the Balatanya's Maamer Sheishis Yomim Teichel Matzos from his Siddur, that Chazal see in eating the grain something that is connected to a certain development in the cognitive abilities of the toddler, of the infant, to the point that they could start saying father, mother. So Dagon is representing the moichin, the awareness, the cognitive faculties of the animal soul. So here we bring animal fodder, but not just animal fodder, the grain, barley, Dagon. So what does this represent? Hakrava Saima represents working, elevating, sublimating the moichin, the awareness of my animal soul. Ela shezawinyan ha-moichin the nefesh ha-bahamas. There is the moichin of the nefesh ha-lekis and the moichin of the nefesh ha-bahamas. This is the moichin, the levels of awareness of the animal soul, not the godly soul. It's barley, it's not wheat. Shekivan sheikra Midas hinegam ha-moichin shalem kshudim v'shayachim ala Midas. Because the primary motive and the primary reference point of the animal soul is Midas, emotions. So therefore, even its moichin, its cognitive abilities are always vis-a-vis, they're always connected to the Midas. So that's why even the grain is animal fodder. Why? Because this is the moichin of the animal soul, which is unique. It's not like the moichin of the divine soul. It's like the mind of an animal. The mind of an animal is ultimately connected to giving it ideas about its survival, about its existence, about its comfort, about how it feels. It's not transcendent cognitive abilities. Of course. That's why this connects to the Maamer we learned before Pesach, Sheishis Yomim from the Alter Rebbe, from the Balatanya Siddur. First you eat matzah, which represents mashcheni, right? Like the Zohar says, matzah is michlud ma'imnus, it's the bread of Emunah. That's matzah. Then begins the carbon Iyar, which is only the second day. And like he said in the beginning of the Maamer, Yitzias Mitzrayim is the gift from above. Mashcheni, draw me in. Then begins the avodah with my animal soul, because mashcheni is not felt by my animal soul. Like we learned in the beginning, in the previous classes, the first class, ki baracham, that to run away. That to run away because the nefesh habahamis was still very, very intense. It was unmoved. It was unscathed. It was untouched. The animal soul is still intense. You have to run away. You have to run away from who? You have to run away from certain voices inside of yourself. You can't deal with it because... Yeah, you're asking, what is this consciousness exactly of the Nefesh HaBahamas calling Father? So wait one moment. Ol achere hakrava soimer, shezawinyan bidur ha-moichin the Nefesh HaBahamas, ba ha-avodah de bidur ha-midas Nefesh HaBahamas adis v'de soimer. After one brings the Iyar, which represents, again, working, sublimating, elevating, inspiring the moichin of the animal soul. Now comes the counting. This is already working with the Midas. Lemimni yaim, lemimni shavu. The Gemara says in Menachos, you count days, you count weeks. V'hainu da'akrov, v'asayim mishavim birid ha-moichin ha-shayachim ala Midas. Harei ze b'yom alav echad b'lvat hazayim b'nissen. When you're dealing with working with the moichin, you can do it in one day. Elevating the moichin of the Nefesh HaBahamas, which are also connected to Midas, but their moichin, one day is enough. They didn't bring the Iyar for 49 days. It wasn't a carbon that continued for 7 weeks. It was a carbon that was brought one time to Zayonism, and you're good. But now starts the count. The count, Havel Svidus, Emer Shawinyan, Bidur HaMidas Atzman, Alzelei Maspika Bidur Beklalos. Here, it's not enough just a general sublimation which can happen in one day. Every midah individually, from the 7 midos, every midah needs to be refined. Hence, you can't do it in one day. You need 7 days. Furthermore, the refinement has to be detailed. You have to get into the nitty-gritty of the midas. To elevate each midah the way it encompasses all the 7 midas, because each midah, if you dissect it, it has within it 7 dimensions. Like, for example, chesed. We have chesed shebechesed, and we have gvura shebechesed. We have tiferes shebechesed, netzach shebechesed, hoyt shebechesed, yisoid shebechesed, malchus shebechesed. V'hainu shahabir b'klolus b'derech makev b'lvad ve'ein negei l'poyel. If the elevation would just be general, it would be also more superficial, and it wouldn't be relevant in a practical sense. But the main thing is the avodah la'at slowly in increments with your own initiative and your own power. And for this, you're going and dissecting the details of the experiences of the animal soul. If we should call midah klulim mizayin midas, the way each midah encompasses all the 7. Shaideis and nasis havodah ba'ofen shebechol rochecha de'eyu shekol protei anyan demachshava debura ma'isi yikedibayi. This allows a person to really delve into all aspects of their life and all experiences of their life. As the pasuk says in Mishlei, "Bechol drochecha de'u," in all your ways you shall know him. The focus here is, the emphasis is all your ways. In other words, really get a hold of bechol drochecha, all your ways. And then what happens is that all the details, the aspects of your life, meaning your ongoing thoughts, your words, your actions, become kedibai, become aligned with your truest and most beautiful essence and purpose. So let's some questions here. So let's try to explain a little bit what we're learning here. There's Meichen and there's Midas. I hope that's clear by now. What's the Meichen and Midas? Meichen is the way the animal soul looks at the world. It's philosophy, so to speak. It's perspective, how it sees life. Midas is not how it sees life, how it experiences life. And you know the two are not the same. I can explain to you something, and you get it. It's the way you see things. You get it, you understand it. You may like it, it resonates. But the experience, that may be very different. Because experience, this is my actual emotional responses and triggers. Midas is a whole different world than Meichen. Meichen is cerebral. Meichen is the way I understand it. It's geschmack. But Ma'aseh b'poel, I get into the office, I get home, I'm triggered, I'm angry, I'm obsessed, I'm overwhelmed, I'm jealous, I'm frustrated, I'm full of anxiety and stress. Yeah, but you just heard a beautiful shiur from Rabbi YY. It's a beautiful shiur, it wasn't with my emotions. The avodah of Meichen, the avodah of Midas is a different avodah. You don't go to Midas before you do Biddur HaMeichen. But he says Biddur HaMeichen is a 1 day, it's a 1 day avodah. Now, 1 day doesn't mean it's a small avodah. But 1 day avodah means it's a shift in consciousness. It's a shift in perspective. You get it. You get it. To get to that day, Iyar. To get to that day, you have to harave, to understand. But once you understand, you understand. The Nefesh HaBahamis could start seeing the world from a more elevated perspective. And that's very big, that's amazing. That's Hakravas Maamer. You cut the barley, you extract the kernels, you grind it into flour. Not a small avodah. You put it in the sieve, 13 sieves to filter it, to refine it. It has to be uplifted. It has to be waved. As we learned, that you don't obliterate the animal soul. You have to lift it up. And then there's kmitza, the kohen takes a fistful. Part of it is burned. Part of it is eaten. That's the Maamer. All of this is working with the animal fodder, but it's dagan. Dagan means it's grain. Grain, the Gemara says, is connected to moichin. Which moichin? The moichin of sa'irim, of barley. It's not wheat, which is the moichin of the animal soul. What's the difference of moichin of the animal soul and moichin of the divine soul? The divine soul essentially is connected to moichin. The animal soul essentially is connected to Midas. Even the animal soul's moichin is part of the Midas. And even the divine soul's Midas are part of the moichin. Why? The animal, like every animal, its focus is one thing. Its focus is, what's for breakfast? I don't know if you ever saw videos or you ever went to the jungle and watched, packs of animals, packs of wolves, families of lions, or those who share a lot of our DNA, chimpanzees, chimps, gorillas, monkeys. Fascinating. But what's the focus? The focus is what's for breakfast, what's for lunch, what's for dinner. And you sit, you groom each other. There's a certain geschmack there. It's a simplicity. Now, some people believe that all humans were like that. We were all foragers and just focusing on breakfast, lunch, and supper. And the truth is sometimes we are like that, right? I sometimes go to a hotel for a program. The big question is, when is lunch? After lunch, where's the tea room? After the tea room, when is dinner? After dinner, when is breakfast? Because we share a lot of DNA with chimps. 99% of our DNA we share with chimps. The question is, when is breakfast? Reb Arda, when is breakfast?
Before lunch.
Before lunch, okay? That's the question. It's not a bad question. It's just an animal question. It's not a bad question. In fact, the Gemara says in Brachos, you have to feed the animal before you feed yourself. In other words, the focal point of the animal is self-preservation, self-gratification. There's an expression in one of the Maimarim, a behema kemon nicht gesehen Himmel. A behema, mammal, never sees heaven. It's not part of its vocabulary. The godly soul asks different questions. The godly soul is a chelik elikam mimal. It's a piece of Hashem. So it looks at the world from the divine perspective. It has antennas to other questions. It's looking for meaning. It's looking for purpose. It's looking for transcendence. It's looking for oneness. And you know what? We have both. We're animals and we're divine. That's the beauty and the challenge of a human being. Sometimes I operate on one level of consciousness and all I'm asking is, when is breakfast? When is lunch? When is dinner? Whatever that means in my life. It could be breakfast, lunch, and dinner, or it could mean anything else that focuses merely on the here and the now, the gratification, comfort, survival. It's a very normal thing. It's part of who we are. So even animals are brilliant. They have great cognitive abilities, brilliant memories, emotions, intelligence. But the intelligence of the animal is called moichin hashayachim el hamidus. In the yeshivish language, it's a din in the midas. It's a geder in the midas. In other words, in order to obtain breakfast, they don't call it breakfast. In order to obtain breakfast, you have to use your mind. You have to sometimes be sharp and be fast and be alert. And you know how the chimps figure out how to use the tools in order to get to the ants and to the maggots and to the knots and to the sugar and to the honey. Every animal has its moichin, it has its intelligence, its brain. But what is the brain focused on? The brain is focused on a way of nurturing your experiences, of fulfilling your cravings, your desires, your instincts, whatever they are. In that sense, by us as well. Human beings are very sophisticated. We have unbelievable moichin. And with those moichin, you can create museums and create adventure parks and create airplanes and create all of the amazing technology that we have created over the last few thousand years, especially the last 100 years. But essentially, if the moichin is just serving the purpose of my animal consciousness, it's called moichin hashayachim el midas. The moichin are all there just to serve midas. They can't transcend themselves. They're just there to help me facilitate whatever my emotions are, and they'll just figure out the best way to do it. The Nefesh Elokis, its moichin, have the ability of abstraction, transcendence, to ask the ultimate questions. So it's a very different type of moichin. And therefore, the birur of the Nefesh HaBaham is the first thing is birur HaMoichin, how it sees the world. The animal sees the world like an animal sees the world. It's very much focused on what you would call today in neuroscience the limbic brain, the amygdala of the brain, the limbic brain, the part of the brain that's responsible for survival, fight or flight, or the part of the brain that's responsible for emotions. Very, very important parts of the brain. Those are like the foundations. But not the prefrontal cortex, which has the ability to be able to look at things from a long-term perspective, to be able to delay gratification, to be able to appreciate morality, empathy, to be able to see things long-term, to be able to see things in the grand picture, the ability for transcendence. Those parts of the brain are physically associated with different levels of consciousness. And in general terms, you're dealing with the animal soul versus the godly soul. So Hakravas Ha'omer is helping to align my animal soul's perspective with the godly soul's perspective. Helping my animal look at the world from a more broad space, from a more expansive space. The world is not a scary place where I have to only survive. The world is a place of oneness. The world is a place of godliness. The world is a place of Ein Sof. Now comes Midas. Midas is the actual experience, not how I see the world, how I experience the world. This is not a sheer anymore. You can't do this in one day. Now you have to work with your Midas, see what's going on, and you got to get into the details. What's triggering you? How do you respond to things? When your wife tells you something, how do you react? When your husband tells you something, how do you react emotionally? How do you react emotionally to your children? How do you react emotionally to your parents, to your siblings, to people in shul, to people in the supermarket, to people in the office, to strangers on the plane? How do you react when you're calling the IRS or you're calling your insurance company? Not good, huh? The Midas is already my emotional day-to-day experiences of the world. This I need to work on. Now the Midas are always connected to the Moichin, because awareness is ultimately what results in my emotional experiences, right? Every emotional experience is a result of a certain awareness. Whatever that awareness is, conscious or unconscious, revealed or not revealed. But Midas is always a result on some level of Moichin. There's no emotion in the world, there's no experience, internal experience in the world that's not fueled by some type of awareness. That awareness may be embedded very deeply in me. That's why the first step is Birur HaMoichin. That's Hakravas Ha'omer. Sfiras Ha'omer is 49 days. Now I'm working with every single midah in detail. 1 week dedicated to Chesed, 1 week dedicated to Gvura, and then Tiferes, Netzach, this week Netzach, and then Hoid, Yesod, and then Malchus. And each one needs to be dissected, because now you want really a full-fledged spiritual therapy work with your animal soul. Yeah. The answer to this is, great question. How do you do this? And what's the difference in Moichin and Midas? The first avodah is much less vulnerable. The avodah of Birur HaMoichin is much less vulnerable because it's dealing basically with perspective. It's dealing with cerebral levels of reality, which is very important. It's trying to understand things. But Midas is actually tuning in and noticing and focusing on my experiences of reality. There are people that on a cerebral level, they are very, very good. They mean well and they're wonderful and they have their mind in a wonderful place. But nobody ever helped them work on their Midas. Yes, exactly. It requires the discipline to notice of how I'm reacting, how I am experiencing things. In other words, how my animal soul lives. My animal soul is pulsating with emotions. It's always experiencing life. Animals are intense also. And we don't want to run away from our animal soul, because what did we learn in the previous year? Narutza. The divine soul gives to the animal soul, but the animal soul, this is one of the great Kedoshim, one of the great emphasis in Chassidus, especially in Chabad, that the animal soul gives to the divine soul. It's not just the divine soul gives to the animal soul. There's something about the animal soul, as I said, the narutza, the quality of the intensity of it, the power of it, the vigor, the energy, the electricity of it that the divine soul needs. Or as we learned in other Maamarim, that animal soul comes from Tohu, divine soul comes from Tikkun. In Tikkun, everything is structured. In Tohu, everything is chaotic. But that chaos has something very powerful to it. So by working with the animal soul, and yes, by becoming aware, not just of the moichin. So Hakravas Aimer is moichin, Sfiras Aimer is Midas. Verstehst? How is breakfast, by the way? Oh, by you it's already dinner. Okay. So you already had breakfast. The Americans didn't have breakfast yet. Yeah, I agree. The feedback loop between Moichin and Midas makes so much sense. Ultimately then, to be human, or a spiritual person, is to lead with the Moichin, yes. And hence, the system of the Balatanya is called Chabad, which is Chachma, Bina, Das, but not to amputate the Midas. What happens sometimes is we amputate the Midas, we repress our emotions, we don't deal with it, and there's a reason for it. It gets ugly, gets dirty. Midas are messy, they're gooey. Is that the word, gooey? They're messy, There was a philosopher. He once said that family life, Nietzsche, he once said that, I don't remember the quote exactly, but he said that family life is so messy and it destroys your life. And he said it's very good to have family from a far distance. And this is a tragedy of his words, because what he meant was, of course it's messy. Any relationship that's close is messy. Maybe there are some exceptions, but you have to work through yourself. The other person has to work through themselves. And you have to interact. It's constant work. When you get to the level of Midas, there's a lot of avodah. And it's constant. You peel one layer of the onion, there's another layer of the onion. It's not Sfiras Aimer once in your life and then you're done. So that's the difference between Hakravas Aimer and Sfiras Aimer. Yesh levayer das Rabbeinu Yeruchim שבזמן הזה יש חילוק בין המצווה לממנה יומה למצווה לממנה שבוי. Now here we come to an extraordinary piece in the Maamer, where he's going to quote a shitta in halacha, known as the view of Rabbeinu Yeruchim. It's not very well known, but he's going to quote it here and give it a very powerful interpretation. This is the view of Rabbeinu Yeruchim. Rabbeinu Yeruchim tainas that there's a difference between the mitzvah of counting days and the mitzvah of counting weeks. There's a fundamental difference between the two. Let's see what he says. The Rebbe explains. Hine yesh oimrim. There's an opinion. Shegam bezman agalus mitzvah midayrais. There's an opinion that even in the time of exile, when there's no Beis Hamikdash, the mitzvah of Sfiras HaOmer is a biblical obligation min HaTorah. This is the view of the Rambam in Hilchis Midin Umusaf and Perek Zayin Halacha Chav Beis. It's the view of the Chinuch Mitzvah Shinvav, who usually follows the Rambam, that Sfiras HaOmer even now is min HaTorah. But v'yesh Oimrim, there's another opinion. Shebizman HaGalus Mitzvah Sfiras HaOmer Irak B'Dirabanan. In the time of Galus, the mitzvah is only rabbinic. This is the view of Tosfos Masechta Menachos Daf Samach Vav, and other poskim And what's the argument between them? Pashut. It says, Usfartem lachem imacharas haShabbos miyoyim aviyachem es oimerat nufer sheva Shabbos es mimis tiyana. You have to count from the day you bring the carbon. So the opinion of Tosfos is if you're not bringing the carbon, there's no mitzvah of svira. The Rabbanan said we should count Zeichel HaMikdash, to remember the way it was the Beis HaMikdash. Just like we do other things, Zeichel HaMikdash. We do the sandwich by the Seder, Zeichel HaMikdash Keinasa Hillel. We shake lulav 7 days of Sukkot, not only the first day, even though they used to not do it, only in the Beis HaMikdash. Again, Zeichel HaMikdash. One of the things we do Zeichel HaMikdash is Sfiras HaOmer. We remember the way they stood in time in the Beis HaMikdash. And by the way, that's why right after the bracha and counting, what do we say? In many kehillas, what is said? A tefillah. What's the tefillah? Harachamanu yakzilonu avodas beis hamikdash l'mkayma b'meira b'yameinu amen selah. May Hashem restore to us the service in the Beis HaMikdash speedily in our days. Amen forever. Why? Why shouldn't we say Harachaman? Why don't you say Harachaman after you put on tefillin? Why don't you say Harachaman after you put on tzitzis? The answer is because tefillin is Medairaisa today, and tzitzis is Medairaisa. Sukkah is Medairaisa, Shofar is Medairaisa. Eating matzah the first night is Medairaisa. But Sfiras HaOmer can't be Medairaisa. There's no Omer. There's no Omer, there's no Sfiras HaOmer. So Tosfos says, why do we count today? It's a mitzvah d'Rabbanan. The Rambam disagrees. The Rambam says clearly it's a mitzvah esim and atayid even when there's no Beis HaMikdash. Why? Because the mitzvah is not dependent on the carbon Omer. The mitzvah begins on the day when they brought the Omer. The question is how you learn the words miyoyim aviyachem asemerat nufa. According to Tosfos, it's from the day you bring it, that's when you count. In other words, you have to bring the Omer in order to have the obligation to count. The Rambam says it's just a siman, it's just a date. When do you count? On the day that they brought the Omer. But even if you're not bringing the Omer, there's the day when you're supposed to bring the Omer. And that's Tazayinus, and the mitzvah of counting still applies. This is a huge machloikas and halacha. And it has, of course, many ramifications. If Sfiras HaOmer is Medairaisa, it's a different level than if Sfiras HaOmer is Medarabbanan. This is a very famous argument between the Rambam on one side, Tosfos on the other side. The Balatanya and Shulchan Aruch and Sfiras HaOmer Siman Tov Peites discusses this machloikas at length. But then there is another shitta. Another shitta, and this is the shitta of Rabbeinu Yerucham. What's the shitta of Rabbeinu Yerucham? So I'm going to read it to you here. He has a fascinating shitta. Let's see it in the Maamer, and then I'm going to quote it to you from the original because it'll be kedai. Ach Rabbeinu Yerucham mechalik ben Sfiras Hayam Sfiras HaShavuos. Rabbeinu Yerucham tells us that there's a big difference between the counting of the days and the counting of the weeks. What's the difference? Says Rabbeinu Yerucham, Shesfiras Hayamim gam bizman hazeh midoraisa. Ach Sfiras HaShavuos midrabbanan. Counting of days, even today, is min haTorah. Counting of weeks is only midrabbanan. What's Rabbeinu Yerucham saying? He says like this. This is Rabbeinu Yerucham, Sefer told us Adam v'Chava, Chelik Adam, Nesiv He, Chelik Dalet. So he says something brilliant. Rabbeinu Yerucham says that in the Torah there's two parshias. It says, Shiva Shavua is Tisper Loch. You should count 7 weeks. It also says, Usfartim Lachem imacharas haShabbos, Miyoyim aviyachem es emirat nufa, Sheva Shabbos es tmimis tiyena. So one pasuk speaks about Shiva Shavuos Tispalach, you should count 7 weeks. Yeah. Usfartim lachem imacharas Shabbos miyem vayachem es emirat nufa, Sheva Shabbos es tmimis tiyena. Ad mimacharas haShabbos hashviyis tispiru chamishim yoyim. Says Rabbeinu Yerucham, when the Torah mentions weeks, it mentions the carbon Omer. When the Torah mentions days, it doesn't mention the carbon Omer. So he says, Sfiras Hayomim is min haTorah even now. Sfiras HaShavuos is only when there's a carbon Omer. This is the view of Rabbeinu Yerucham. Rabbeinu Yerucham lived in the 13th century in France and Spain. He was one of the Rishonim. So he says, it depends which counting we're talking about. The days of the weeks. The counting of the days is biblically mandated even today. The counting of the weeks is only a rabbinic mandate. So he's like a combination, a hybrid between the first two opinions. Because he says, like the Rambam, it's a biblical mitzvah to count, right? But only days. In the time of the Beis HaMikdash, the mitzvah was to count days and weeks. Today, the mitzvah min HaTorah is only days. The rabbis added weeks. Why? What's the logic? Because when the Torah tells us to count the weeks, it says it in the context of the Omer offering. Usvartem lachem mimakshap miyoma vi'achem es Omer atnufa sheva shabbosos tmimos tiyena. Weeks, you need the Omer. But when the Torah says to count the days, it says so independently of the Omer offering. So even without the Omer, there's still a mitzvah to count 49 days. So what would this mean practically? We do both. We count days, we count weeks. For example, we say, today is 7 days, which is 1 week. Today is 8 days, which is a week and a day. Today is 9 days, which is a week and 2 days. Says Rabbeinu Yerucham, when you say today is 7 days, that's a mitzvah min HaTorah. When you say 7 days, which is 1 week, that's only a mitzvah d'Rabbanan. Time of the Beis HaMikdash, they were both min HaTorah. Today, weeks is b'd'Rabbanan, days is min HaTorah. Get it? This is gewaldige chiddush of Rabbeinu Yerucham. It's very, very strange. What's the Havana in this? The view of the Rambam and Tosfos is clear. Either the entire obligation is biblical, or the entire obligation is rabbinic. But the split that Rabbeinu Yerucham makes seems so strange. Why would the Torah make this differentiation? Why would it deny us the opportunity to count the weeks during exile, but still obligate us to count the days even when we're lacking a Beis HaMikdash? It's a gewaldige kasha. We know he brings good proofs. Rabbeinu Yerucham brings excellent proofs, gewaldig. But we're trying to understand the back-end program, Alpinister. What's the Havana that the Rebbeinu Shalom would say? There's no Beis HaMikdash. Continue to count days, but no weeks. That only the rabbis introduced. You teufels the Shaila. So it's a big pella. How do you explain this? It's a madna zach. We're not asking Rabbeinu Yerucham. We're asking on why would the Torah make this split? Like God says, you want me to count? You don't want me to count. Yeah, I want you to count days, but I don't want you to count weeks. When there was a Beis HaMikdash, I wanted you to count weeks also. What's the Havana that to count weeks, you need a carbon? And to count days, you don't need a carbonimer. You could do it even after the Beis HaMikdash. That's the question. Based on this whole Maamer, he says, we'll be able to understand very well what Rabbeinu Yerucham is saying. I like to give some history so people know who this is. So I'm just going to say who he was. Rabbeinu Yerucham, his father's name was Meshulam. Rabbeinu Yerucham ben Meshulam. He was born approximately 1290. He passed away approximately 1350. He was a prominent sage, rabbi, and posek during the period of the Rishonim. He was born in Provence in France, as I said, 1290. In 1306, after the Jewish expulsion from France, he moved to Toledo, Spain. During this time of his life, he became a student of the Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher ben Yechiel, the great Rosh, who lived in Toledo. He was the Rebbe of Rabbeinu Yerucham. In the year 1330, he began writing his work, Sefer Meisharim on civil law. He completed this work in 4 years. At the end of his life, he wrote his main halachic work, which I've been quoting now, known as Sefer Toldus Adam v'Chava, the offspring of Adam and Chava, and various components of halacha as ruled by Rabbeinu Yerucham have been codified in Shulchan Aruch in the name of Rabbeinu Yerucham. You will see him quoted, this Rabbeinu Yerucham. He greatly influenced the Beis Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Karo, and therefore he's quoted extensively by the author of the Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Yosef Karo, both in the Shulchan Aruch as well as in his commentary, Beis Yosef on the Torah. So here the Rebbe explains the depth behind Rabbeinu Yerucham's Shitta. Now listen to the Vart. V'yesh loymar habir baz at the last line. V'yesh loymar habir baz al pi hanal. Based on what we explained, we'll understand the difference. Shesviras hashavuos hu inyan birur klolos hamida. Usviras hayamim hu inyan birur kol prata pracha b'chol mida. Counting the weeks. Let me ask another question. What's this idea of counting the weeks if you're counting days? I want to ask you a question. How brilliant do you have to be to figure out that 14 days is 2 weeks? What's the point? The Gemara says, mitzvah lemimne yoim, mitzvah lemimne shavua. Because the pasuk says both. It says to count 50 days, and it says to count 7 weeks. So we do both. Why? One seems superfluous. If you tell me that today is 2 weeks and 1 day, I know that it's 15 days. You tell me that today is 15 days. I know that it's 2 weeks and 1 day. Choose. What do you have to do both? Stam. The Rebbe says, no, it's two different avodas. The counting of the week is dealing with the core of the midah, the klolos hamidah, getting to the essence of it. The counting of the days is dealing with the protim, with the manifestations. It's a very different avodah. When I take on a week, I'm taking on chesed, gvura, tiferes, netzach, chod yesod malchus. I'm getting to the core energy of my chesed, my gvura, my tiferes. Counting the days is chesed shebenetzach, gvura shebenetzach, tiferes shebenetzach. It's the way it's manifested. It's the way it's branched off, and the way it's expressive in my thoughts, behaviors, and actions. Al piza, hine sviris hayamim, shoinyan bidur kol pratei hamidis, kivon sheinyan zeh shayach lavayda b'pel b'machshava dibra maisa. This is practical, how it's affecting your thoughts, words, and behavior. Shetzrich eliyas v'yeshna b'chalesa b'chol zman. This you have to be in control of always. Lachem chiyuv sviris hayamim gam b'zman hazeh midaraisa. So the obligation to count days even today is min ha'Torah. Mashenkin sviris hashavuas, shoinyan bidur klalos hamidah. Counting the weeks is already a more powerful spiritual consciousness where you're dealing with the whole midah, not necessarily the way it's affecting you practically. Even though it has a superior quality to the avodah of counting days, because you're actually getting in to the whole general energy of the midah. On the other hand, because it's a higher avodah and it's not so practical, today we can't count weeks. We can't be mevarek klalos hamidah. The koyach we do have min ha'Torah is avodah b'poil. Yeah. I'll explain. This is serious stuff. There's a huge difference between, now tune in here, because it's not just relevant, it's first of all, it's very rich, but it's also extremely relevant for life. Okay? What is the Rebbe teaching us here? In the Bidur HaMidas itself, you can't compare the counting of days to the counting of weeks. It's two completely different avodas. So let's understand what this means. The first week, we focus on chesed. We focus on the love in our life. That's chesed. The second week, we focus on gvura. That's the avodah of Sfiras HaOmer, right? We're counting these 7 weeks. We're going through a process of healing, of recovery, of alignment, focusing on one of the 7 emotions of our life, examining it, refining it, fixing it, aligning it with our divine emotions, with our divine core, with our infinity. So the first week, let's say we focus on love. Do I know how to express love? Do I know how to receive love? Do I love others? Do I love myself? Do I know how to love? The second week, I focus on gvura, my capacity for boundaries. Do I know how to create boundaries? Do I know how to discipline? Do I know how to discipline myself? Because all discipline comes from disciplining yourself. So tell this Yaakov Yosef quotes from the Baal Shem Tov. Why twice? Before you rebuke somebody else, you have to first rebuke yourself to make sure it's coming from a healthy place, to make sure that your boundaries are in order. So the second week I focus on gvura. Do I know how to create and maintain proper borders? The third week, we focus on tiferes. What's tiferes? My ability for empathy. Do I know how to empathize? Tiferes is Midas harachamim, compassion. Do I know how to be here for someone else on their terms, not mine? The fourth week, we focus on Netzach, my ability to triumph in the face of adversity. Netzach is victory. Do I know how to win? Do I have ambition? Do I know how to follow through with my ambition? The fifth week, our ability to express gratitude. That's Hoid. Show vulnerability. Admit mistakes. Do you know how to admit mistakes? Anybody? Any of the men know how to admit mistakes? The sixth week, our ability to communicate on bond. The seventh week, our skills as leaders. Am I confident enough to lead? Malchus. Do I know how to be a leader? Do I know how to lead? Do I possess inner dignity? Is my leadership driven by insecurity, by egotism, by narcissism? I'm just giving one translation of the 7 Midas, the way we work on it. But there's a difference between days and weeks. What's the difference? When we focus on days, what are we focusing on? We're focusing on how each one of these traits is divided into 7. In Chesed is 7, in Gvura is 7, in Tiferes is 7, etc. Each of these 7 traits is expressed in our life in various thoughts and various words and various deeds. So during the 7 days of each week, we focus each day on another detail of this midah. We focus on another particular expression of this trait in our lives. So if the week count represents tackling the core of the emotion, the day count represents not tackling the core of the emotion, but how it expresses itself in my daily life, in my behaviors, in my thoughts, and in my words. So here is the difference. When I say today is 1 week of the Iyar, today is 2 weeks of them, what am I saying? Today I managed to tune in to the full scope of that emotion, transforming it and healing it at its core. That's what the week represents. It's taking everything of Chesed, because the week means all the details of Chesed, and getting to the sum total, to the Sach Hakel, to the Tamtzis, to the quintessence, what he calls here, Birur Klolus Hamidah. I tackle the Midah at its core, and I align it with my divine essence. That's the Birur of the week. Well, one second, just finish. Every once in a while, you hear what you may call a miracle story. You know, somebody who was struggling with an addiction for many years, and they have a deep insight, or they go through a therapeutic program, and they come out healed. They touch such a deep place within themselves that it transformed their life. The addiction is gone, the anger is gone, the jealousy is gone. Like a child who's being toilet trained, at one point, he stops entertaining the idea of using a diaper. He never uses it again. He matured. So there's a possibility of counting weeks, of completely transforming a particular emotion, weeding out the distortions. You're not dealing with a detail of chesed, with a detail of gvura. No, that's yamin. Shavua is, you're taking all the details of the midah and you're capturing the week, which means the totality, the holistic, organic oneness of the midah, and you're transforming it. But to be honest, that's a very unique and rare experience. So we have the second model of self-refinement. What's the second model? The second model is the day model. What's the day model? I'm not always capable of the week model, but I'm always capable of the day model. What does this mean? What's the difference? It's a deep opinion. Okay. I'm driving my car. Okay. I approach a red light. Someone is in the back seat screaming, "Go, take the light, take the light. We got to make it. Take the light." The guy is screaming in your ear. It's annoying. But you're the one behind the wheel. Will you take the light or not take the light? Hopefully you won't. He's screaming. That's fine. But you say, I'm by the wheel. He is an alien voice. He doesn't understand the consequences. He's a stranger. He's bringing up a ludicrous and dangerous idea. I can't stop the screaming, but I can identify it, quarantine it, put it in context of where it belongs, and hold on to the wheel and do the right thing. But what happens if when I hear the voice, take the light, I decide that it's my rational mind speaking to me? This is my intelligence speaking to me. It's very hard to say no, because this seems like a rational approach. The same is true with all of our emotions and thoughts. Even when I'm being emotionally hijacked, I have the wheel in my hand. I may not have the ability to transform the urge. I may not be able to stop the screaming of certain thoughts. But as long as I can identify that this thought or this emotion is not my essence, and it's coming from a part of me that's insecure and unwholesome, I don't have to allow that emotion to define me and to control my behavior. That's called the day model, not the week model. So the Rebbe says, there's the birur of the klalos hamida, and there's the birur of the prat, the way it's expressed in avodah b'poil. One is a person who really goes through an inner transformation. My midah is changed. It's a different midah. That's the week. You can really get to the core of your chesed, all the details that produce your midah, and transform it. The day is, take one day. Take gvura shebechesed. It's the way the chesed is being manifested. So now a person could look at their life and focus on what their midas are doing to them, what type of thoughts, words, actions they're triggering. And I could say, you know what? I may not be able to change the midah, but I have completely control what's happening with the steering wheel. Will I scream? Will I not scream? Will I space out? Will I remain present? Will I detach? Will I remain attached? Will I engage in conversation? Or will I run away emotionally to New Zealand and China? Will I fall apart and get angry at the whole world? Or will I identify that there's a backseat driver called the animal soul, and it's very, very scared. And when my child said this to me, I was overwhelmed from fear, and I went crazy. But you know what? It's a backseat driver, and I turn to the animal and I say, Tayeda, chimpanzee. You're a good guy, and you're very scared. But there's really a deeper vision here, and therefore we're going to express ourselves differently. The way I'm going to respond is going to be this way. I may not be tackling the core of the midah at its essence, but what I am dealing with is how it affects my life, how it affects my thoughts, my words, my actions, my interactions with others. Comes Rabbi YY Jacobson and says that today there's no mitzvah in our Torah to count weeks, only to count days. In the time of the Beis HaMikdash, when you could bring the carbon to the Beis HaMikdash, the carbon Maamer, then there was a mitzvah to count weeks also. Today, you don't have the koyach necessarily to count weeks. The Rabbanon said you should still count weeks Zeichel HaMikdash. We still always want to try to go as deep as we can. But what's the mitzvah b'poil? The mitzvah in our Torah is only on counting days. Lemimna yoyim, not lemimna shavu. True, to count weeks is a much higher avodah, because you get to tackle the whole midah in its klal. You get the whole picture, the full picture, and you could just transform it. But that's not the avodah that's ultimately negeya and ma'aseh b'poil. What's negeya and ma'aseh b'poil, what's relevant to your practical behavior is counting days, not counting weeks. So Rabbi YY Jacobson says, counting days today is biblical. Counting weeks is only rabbinic. Is it clear? Even you don't have questions. If you don't have questions, it must be clear. You understand the word? Very, very rich word. Very rich word. Rebbe Zriel, the herst, was tut sich. Sometimes people feel that healing has to be complete. The whole midah has to be transformed. If you could, gewaldig, we're in. If you could change the whole midah around, if you could take the whole midah chesed and realign it, the whole gvura, the whole tiferes, the whole netzach, that's the week. The week is you tackle the midah from all directions, from all angles. You get to the tamtzis of it because you have all the 7 days, right? You get like to the core, to the jinim, to the core of it. That's birur klolos hamidah. The ganze midah is transformed. Gewaldig. But don't demand this from yourself. Don't feel guilty. That's the word. People feel guilty. They feel, I'm not good. I'm not doing Sfiras Omer. So Rabbi Yeruchim says, Chavre, Tosfos holds everything is Midrabanan. Min HaTorah does Bechlal no mitzvah Sfiras Omer. You really have to appreciate the limitations. Rambam holds everything is Min HaTorah. Rabbi Yeruchim says, weeks Min HaTorah, weeks Midrabanan, days Min HaTorah. You can't feel guilty. Don't beat yourself up that today you don't always have the energy to change the ganze midah, the whole midah. You can't. We don't have the koyach. But you do have the koyach to be in control of how the midah gets expressed and manifested in the details of your life. How I speak to people, how I react to people, how I live, how I behave, and how I think. The animal soul, is screaming, afraid. Okay, you have a backseat driver who's hollering and frightened and screaming. Hold on to the steering wheel. As long as you can identify where it's coming from with compassion, that's fine. You say, I already did Birur HaMoichin. Birur HaMoichin is maybe cerebral, but my experience has not changed. I'm still being triggered. This is where you need to be able to appreciate the difference of the day model and the week model. The day model is the way it applies to your thoughts, your words, and your actions. And as he puts it in the Maamer, this is something that could be and has to be always during the Beis HaMikdash and during Galus. And that's why the chiyuv, the obligation to count days, even Bisman Hazeh, is Min HaTorah. You want to know, how do we explain the Rambam? He doesn't say, but it could be that the Rambam, who was the ultimate Bal Moichin and believed in the power of the intellect, felt that you could do even weeks. And Tosfos appreciated perhaps the harsh realities of the traumas of exile and said, you have to try, but even the Torah is not obligating you because there are so many pitfalls. Perhaps. I'm not saying this as in an authoritative way because the Maamer doesn't say it. I don't have the authority to say that. You have to know also how my modern works. He's not always explaining every side. He's just he said this Maamer gives perspective to what Rabbeinu Yeruchim says. How it fits in with Tosfos and the Rambam, you have to know. He doesn't say it in the Maamer. So, everybody could speculate on their own. I don't have the ability to say what Tosfos felt about this because it's a sensitive thing. But this gives us a pesamahalach. It shows Rabbeinu Yeruchim's differentiation is not stam, It's like almost stubbornly. Weeks, yeah, and weeks not, and days, yeah. There's a theme behind it. There's a big theme behind it. Right. The Rambam and Tosfos say it's either or. Either it's all rabbinic, or it's all... Rabbeinu Yeruchim brilliantly analyzes the psukim and he shows that where it says weeks, it always mentions the carbon Omer, and when it says days, it does not mention the carbon Omer. Somebody says, it seems that you need to tackle the days before you can tackle the weeks. Perhaps. It's also important to emphasize that this Maamer is explaining the shit of Rabbeinu Yeruchim, meaning the Rebbe is not saying that you could never be mevarer your week. He's not saying that the week model is inapplicable, that there's no midah that you can tackle and transform. Of course you may, and that's why the rabbis obligate us. He's just explaining the view of Rabbeinu Yeruchim that min ha-Torah, don't make this an obligation. When Torah gives an obligation, it means that you're capable of doing it. I can't tell you to do something and you're not capable. So he's just explaining why, according to Rabbeinu Yeruchim, it's not a chiyuv min ha-Torah to do. But of course, there's many situations where a person can also really make a change in the Klolus Hamidah. I think that's it. I'm going to wish you all a beautiful Shabbos. We're going to resume this Maamer, Be'ezer Hashem, on Monday morning, 7:30 a.m. Have a wonderful day. No, both are very important. The fixing of the Moichin is really helping refine my perspective. But that's on a perspective level, how I see things. But as you know, you can explain it to me and I can understand it, and it's important, because without that, there's no change. But then in reality, I'm just triggered and I'm not in control. And that's where I have to work on my responses, on my midas, like what's happening inside of me. Like, why did you just space out? I'll give you an example in a marriage. Some couples, right, they have a wonderful conversation, they understand each other, it's amazing. And then something happens a day later, she says something, he says something, and boom. And you're like in different worlds. What happened? It was so geschmack yesterday. The answer is, don't beat yourself up. This was moichin, this was midas. You had a wonderful conversation, you understood each other, you appreciated each other. But then something happened that triggered you emotionally. Maybe it's a memory. Maybe it's a trauma. Maybe it's a repressed experience. Yeah. Maybe it's something you're scared of. So in your mind, you're good. You have no issue. If somebody would ask you advice about this situation, you'd be able to preach for 2 hours, Sometimes I find it humorous about myself. People will ask me advice about situations with children or with spouses or with themselves or with this. And I have right away what to say. I have what to say. And it's wonderful. They love it. Then the same situation happens to me. And I'm like, I don't have what to say anymore. What's the difference? The difference is moichin and midas. In other words, on a cerebral level, I have a lot to say. Makes a lot of sense. But then in Yiddish there's an expression, aseget reinem pupik, when it hits your own kishkas, when it goes into your own navel, it's a different set of rules now. I'm upset, I'm frustrated, I'm angry, I'm melancholy, I'm down. You say, yeah, but you gave a beautiful... Somebody once called me and said, you should listen to the shiur that you gave on this and this day. It'll be very helpful. I used to teach in Borough Park for many years in Heichel Menachem and Borough Park. We had a Sunday morning class in Tanya. It went on for 6 years, and I taught it when I was a bocher. I wasn't married yet. I started to teach a Sunday morning class, and I was not interested in doing it. I was a yeshiva bocher. I didn't see this as my vocation, but somebody was nudging me and driving me crazy. Rabbi Aaron Ginsberg from Borough Park. So I started. And it was Baruch Hashem successful. And after a few years into the class, probably like 3 years or so, I got married. So I remember somebody came over to me. So they called the series A Tale of Two Souls. Somebody came over to me and said, by the way, if you need good marriage advice, you should listen to those classes, A Tale of Two Souls. But the challenge is that moichin is beautiful and moichin is important because moichin sets our head straight. Moichin gives us focus, it gives us perspective. But the real work of life is midas. Real work of life is midas. Not to take away moichin. Moichin is the foundation, it's a prerequisite. Chabad is not mevatel moichin at all, fakert. It's all moichin. But the ikir is midas. The main thing is midas. Midas is who you are. Not how you see the world. That's all good, important. It's the foundation. But who you are as a person. What are your actual relationships like? What are your emotional experiences and responses? That's a whole different world. That's the real world. That's the real messy world. That's as I said, it's gooey. It's like what's really happening. It's putting my midas under a radar. And it's really a very beautiful distinction. Akravasayim and Svidasayim. It gives perspective. Does moichin control midas? Great question. The answer is yes and no. Of course, right? On one level, moichin is very influential. Because every midah is based on an awareness. So you change awareness, you affect your midas. In psychology, there's the big model that was very successful for many years, and still successful often, not always, CBT. What's CBT? Cognitive behavioral therapy. Based on the idea that our cognitive awarenesses of life will affect our responses. However, today we know that there's a lot of things in a person that even if I give you wonderful awareness, it's not going to change it. Because the Midas are rooted in the source in a deeper place than Moichin. Just like the animal soul's source in a way is higher than the divine soul. Esav's source is higher than Yaakov, and Toyu is higher than Tikkun. Midas is rooted in a very, very deep place in the soul. So even though it needs Moichin to mentor it and to parent it and to guide it, but it has its own very, very deep root, and you have to respect that. And sometimes we need different processes in order to deal with it. So we have to be open to both truths. Moichin controls Midas, and a lot of Midas you can help through Moichin, but there's stuff, especially what we call today trauma, that Moichin is not going to do the trick. It just won't do it. You see people, they're wonderful, they mean well. You could give them every lecture in the world and they hear it and they understand it, but in reality, they lose it. The triggers are so deep because it did not get internalized through a cognitive, rational process. It became entrenched in their body and in their psyche in a very primal way, maybe when they were very young, in a way that they couldn't process it intellectually and rationally. So there's no way I can get it out that way. That's why there's a lot of different models. And we have to be open to all of that. And that's part of what he's saying about the weeks. Even if your Moichin can help you for the days, there may be stuff on a core level that you're not getting out, you're not getting rid of. Yet. You need a special koyach. I do have to say that since we're getting closer and closer to the Geula, when we're going to have the carbon Maamer, so therefore there's more and more koyach to count not only days, but also weeks. We get closer to that stage in life. Okay. I wish you all an amazing day, both in counting days and even in counting weeks. Start with counting days, but let's be ambitious. Tafasta Reb David, Reb Dudi. Tafasta bekishkes or rak berosh, kama kol Ashkenazim? Chassidus Chabad ze harbe Moichin, aval atachlis Midas. At yedei haya vikuach bein Admor HaZaken v'shechaverim, הם אמרו, העיקר מידס, והוא אמר לו, מויכן. כי הוא אמר שסוף סוף, מהמויכן אפשר לבוא למידס. כשאין מויכן, אז המידס זה ככה צ'ולנט. צועקים, רעשים, אבל זה צ'ולנט. כשרוצים בירור המידס, צריכים להבין קצת מה שקורה. ודאי מויכן משפיעים על המידס, אבל צריך לדעת גם המגבלות. Moichin משפיע על המידס הרבה, אבל לא צריכים להכות אשמנו על חטא כל פעם, שרואים שהבנתי משהו, והמידס לא נוגע ולא פוגע. כי המידות זה חיים בפני עצמם, הבהמה בגן חיות היא מאוד אקטיבית, זה לא פשוט כל כך. אז צריך להבין שמוichin פועלים על המידות, אבל לפעמים יש דברים עמוקים בעמידות שהמוichin לא יכול לפעול. מה שאומר פה, השבוע, בירור מצווה למימני יומי, מצווה למימני שבועי, שבועי זה משהו אחר. דרישת שלום לירושלים מן הקודש. זה הבן שלך. יפה. הולכים לאכול גלידה, לאפה, מה אתם עושים בירושלים עכשיו? הולכים לקנות לאפה? זה, מה השעה עכשיו?
עכשיו רבע לארבע.
אוקיי. שיהיה בהצלחה. הולכים לגן חיות לראות נפש הבאמית? לא צריכים ללך לגן חיות, אתה אומר. בסדר? שיהיה בהצלחה. It's a pleasure to have all of you. And as Reb Aaron says, it's a privilege and a pleasure to have each and every one of you. Thank you for gracing us with your presence. Have a beautiful day.
So much.
Right. It's true. Breathing is, the Alter Rebbe says, breathing is the bridge in many ways between awareness and our visceral reactions, which in many ways is connected to our midas. It helps, I think it helps ground us. It helps neshama. The word neshama comes from the word neshima. breathing. The Medrash says, Kol haneshama tahalal yutke al kol neshima uneshima. Every breath creates awareness. Every breath is an invitation for praise, for a chant. Every time you breathe, it's an opportunity for a chant. Somebody asked, the text of today's shir was page 66 and page 67 in the source sheets. We started on the top of 66, and we did the first half of 67 as well. Okay, everybody. Hatzlacha, hatzlacha.
This class is brought to you by theyeshiva.net. Please help us continue the classes. Make even a small contribution at www.theyeshiva.net/donate.